so true. What you do this week matters. And before we jump into the bulk of the message this morning, for those of you that are visiting this morning, my name's Scott. I'm one of the pastors here. It's a joy to welcome you. Hopefully you've had a great experience with us thus far. Hopefully it's still going uphill and it doesn't go downhill from here on out, hopefully. And if you're visiting with us, I just want to take a few moments. And if you're not a regular attender here, this may be a little bit different, but hopefully it invites you a little bit into who we are as a community. Before I jump into the message, I want to talk about a few people, groups of people who have made a difference this week. Because what we've talked about over the last few weeks is that what you do each week matters. And we need to be intentional about the way we use our time over time. And this week, I wanted to highlight, again, just a couple of groups of people. One is our worship arts, music, and tech team. I'm just super proud of them and thankful for them. During the services, typically, I stand towards the back. And the reason I do that is because I just want to kind of be in the moment with you and be in the service and just experience it with you as opposed to, thinking about what's coming next and what I'm supposed to do next. And so I often just kind of stand at the back and take it all in. And this morning was just another reminder of how fortunate we are to have such incredibly talented musicians and tech teams who week after week after week give of their time, their energy, and talent so that we can come corporately together as a community and sing and celebrate God. And to be back there and just to see so many of you engaging and singing and doing that, it was just beautiful, powerful. And when Emily was singing that song, which is presently my favorite song, the song Living Hope, if I had hair on my head, it would have been standing up. But instead, I just got a few goosebumps, but I was just back there and just like, wow, this is just powerful. It's so amazing. I'm so blessed to be a part of this community that gets together week after week. So can we just give it up for our music and our tech teams who, again, week after week give of themselves. Amazing, amazing. And I also want to highlight another group of people. You may not know this, but we have a ministry that meets together every single week called Mom to Mom. Actually, I always say it's Mom to Mom, but it's actually Mom to Mom because it's O, not you. And so it's Mom to Mom, and they get together on Wednesday mornings as a group, and there's others that actually get together on Thursday evening because they work during the day. But out of this group of ladies that basically escape their husbands and escape their kids for a couple hours, they get together, and it's not just where they come together and do a Bible study or, share and that kind of thing. It's actually, they build relationships and community. And so what happens is, they might start with, a story or a video or something like that, or have someone speak, but then they break up into small groups of ladies. And because we believe that small groups are the essence, the life force of where you get connected and where you actually feel a part of the church, not just where you attend the church. And so they break out into these small groups. And again, it's more than just going through a study or going through a series of questions, and it's more about developing relationships. And what's beautiful for me to watch is when groups like these actually do things together outside of the time that they typically meet together. And it's powerful for me as a leader, as a pastor, to watch our small groups actually go out into the community and minister and impact the community. And yesterday, I was just so proud when I was on social media and I saw a picture of a group of ladies from our Mom to Mom ministry out serving together. Here they are. This is a group of them. You might not be able to picture them clearly, but they actually went to Ronald McDonald House yesterday morning and served a brunch, breakfast, lunch, whatever you want to call it, to a number of families who didn't want to be where they were. But these ladies went and met them where they were and impacted their lives by serving them. And so for those of you that are a part of this group that went out and did this yesterday, I am incredibly proud of you. And thank you for representing me and representing this church, and more importantly, representing our Heavenly Father by the way that you've loved our community. So can we give it up for ladies like these who week after week, that's powerful stuff, powerful stuff. All right, so what we've been talking about for the last few weeks, if you weren't with us, we've been basically talking about being present in the lives of the next generation. We've been talking about that for the last 3 weeks, that regardless of whether or not you're a parent, you and I have the opportunity, and I believe the responsibility to make an imprint on the hearts and the minds of the next generation. And so we've been talking about 6 principles, or we're going to continue to talk about 6 principles that will help ensure that you and I do just that. And throughout this series, we have been talking about the power of time. That time is our most precious commodity. And because we only have but so much time, what we need more than anything else is wisdom. Wisdom as we make decisions as to what to do or what not to do with the time that we have left, specifically the time that we have left with our kids. And so there's a man in the Old Testament named Moses, a man who many of us, if not all of us, have heard of to varying degrees. Moses prayed a prayer in the Old Testament that has kind of served as the umbrella or the big idea for this entire series. Moses prayed this in the book of Psalms: teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So here's Moses. He wasn't praying this prayer as a parent. He was praying this prayer as the leader of a nation. And he cried out to God, and he said, God, teach me, teach my people, teach all of us to number our days, because if we could do that, we would gain a heart of wisdom. And for those of us that are parents, for those of us adults who are making a difference in the lives of kids, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a coach, whether you serve or volunteer in Bridge Kids or our Remix Student Ministries, we need wisdom. And so Moses basically prayed and said he recognized the way that we gain wisdom is learning to number our days. And if we could do that, we would gain the heart of wisdom that we need. And so if you've missed any of the first 3 weeks of this series, if maybe today is your first time visiting with us, welcome. Hope you're having a great experience. Let me quickly catch you up to speed where we are so far, because we're kind of building on this week after week after week. So the first principle we talked about was that time over time makes a history worth repeating. It takes time, your time, over time, to make a history worth repeating. That all of us, every single one of us, is already making history in the lives of children that are in our homes or in our lives. The question is it a history worth making? Is it a history that's worth talking about? Is it a history that's worth repeating? In order to make that kind of history, it takes your time, you deciding what to do and what not to do with your time over time that will make that kind of history. The kind of history that you'll be proud for your kids to one day pass on to their kids. So it takes time over time to make a history worth repeating. And then 2 weeks ago, we said that love over time reflects worth. That as parents and as adults in the lives of kids, we have to prove our love over time. And the way that we do that is by being present, is by being in the moment. It's by being present and turning off the outside noise, by being present in the moment, by intentionally getting to know, discover, and in some cases rediscover our kids and what makes them who they are. And as we discover those things, no matter how good, no matter how ugly, no matter how bad it gets, you and I never, ever, ever walk away. And as we love the kids under our roof, as we love the kids in our lives, in that way, over time, we reflect worth to them, that they are worth something. And their worth isn't found in what they can do or how well they do what they can do. Their worth is found in simply who they are. And as we reflect that kind of worth in their lives, as we reflect that kind of unconditional love in their lives, they will learn to love themselves in a healthy way. And then our words will have weight when we say them. Because last week we said words over time can impact someone's direction. That the words that you and I choose to give children, the words you and I choose to give our teenagers will shape the way they see the world, the way they see themselves, the way they see God. So, your words matter. Your words matter, especially if you string them together and tell a story. If you ask any teacher, if you ask any marketer, any politician, if you ask a business person, if you ask a photographer or a journalist, if you ask any of them the same question, they will tell you story is everything. Story is everything. Now, have you ever wondered what grandparents, hobbits, and Israelites have in common? You ever? No, I didn't think so. I mean, why would you do that? That's kind of an odd question to ask. But if you think about it long enough, those three groups of people represent three different kinds of stories that every kid needs to develop a healthy perspective of the world. That kids need stories from grandparents. They need stories that are fiction, and they need stories found in the pages of Scripture from the Bible. They need all those kinds of stories in order to shape their perspective about the world. Kids need stories from grandparents. Now, sadly, not every child has the opportunity to hear stories from their biological grandparents. Not every child has that opportunity. So in some cases, the term grandparents may be a figurative term. But nevertheless, kids need people in their lives, adults like you and I, who are old enough, who have been around long enough to be able to open up a photo album and tell them stories about their parents. Tell them stories about their grandparents or their family's heritage. They need people in their lives. It may be an older aunt, it may be an uncle, but every kid needs someone in their life who's been around long enough that can open up a book and show them their family's heritage, their family's legacy. And if kids don't have those kind of stories, if teenagers don't have those kinds of stories, kids will miss out on the relational history that will fuel them to develop a healthy perspective centered around their identity. They need that. They need to have a healthy perspective as to where and what and who they came from. Kids need stories from grandparents. They also need stories that are fiction. Now I don't say this to get into, a debate about Harry Potter or Santa Claus or any of those kind of things. That'll be next time Alan preaches, we'll get into that whole debacle. But I say that because fiction seems to matter to God. Fiction seems to matter to God. I think it's probably because fiction is powerful. I mean, on the one hand, the Bible is true, but on the other hand, it's full of fiction. Fiction was the primary way that Jesus amplified truth. Jesus often taught in what we call parables. They're made up stories. And part of the reason he did that, my guess is that because Jesus recognized that sometimes the best way to clarify truth is to tell a story. And without fiction, kids will miss part of a cultural history that will shape and connect them to a much wider community and help them establish values. Kids need stories that are fiction. And also, kids need Bible stories. And I didn't put this number 3 because it's the least important. I actually put it number 3 because of how important it is. You see, the Bible is not a book. The Bible is a collection of 66 books written by 40 different authors over 1,600 years. The 40 different authors range from all different types of people, from nomads to kings, from prophets, to fishermen. And every single one of their stories connects together to tell one story. The story of God and his incredible love and pursuit and passion for you and I and for them. And without the Bible, without the stories from history found in the scriptures, without these stories, kids could fail to connect. Teenagers could fail to connect the great mysteries of the universe to a creative and loving God. They would fail to have the spiritual history that serves as the foundation to faith. I'm sure you've caught this already, but stories matter. Stories matter. They shape a child. They shape a teenager's perspective. They shape the relational, cultural, and spiritual context that shapes their perspective of the way the world works. So that means you and I, as parents and as adults, we are storytellers. We're producers. We are librarians of the stories that our kids need to hear to build the kind of history and heritage that they need to build as they get older. So the stories that you tell and the stories I tell matter. In other words, the principle is this: stories over time shape someone's perspective. And not just anyone. Stories over time shape your child's perspective and my child's perspective. Stories matter. Stories are one of God's, creative, intelligent ways to help us connect to what really matters. And I believe that God created your imagination. I believe that. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're not sure what you believe about God, Jesus, faith, the Bible, the whole thing. You're not sure what you believe. And if that's you, that's okay. I'm really glad that you're here this morning. But I'm of the belief that God created your imagination, that the way the world works, the complexities, the intricacies of the world, it just causes the need to find a creator. And that the brain is just this thing of creative genius. And so I believe it was created by one. And when it comes to stories, most experts agree. It's as if our minds, as if our brains were hardwired to engage with the way information fits together in the context of a narrative. I read an interesting article on a specialist in this area who said this: in the last 15 years, we have developed the brain imaging technologies that help us shed light on what it means to get lost in a good story. Studies are suggesting that when reading, listening, or watching a good story, we activate brain regions used to process the experience, get this, as if it were our own. In other words, this specialist concludes, we are wired for stories. You and I, our children, our teenagers are wired for stories. In other words, God created your imagination, as I said, and then God invented stories to ignite it. He invented stories to ignite it. And without that kind of imagination, without those stories, you can't see past what you already know. And you can't care what someone else feels, and you can't hope beyond your present experience or past your present situation or circumstance. J.K. Rowling is a famous author. Many of you have read a lot of her books. She said this about imagination. It's powerful. Imagination is not only the uniquely human capacity to envision that which is not. In other words, she's saying it is the uniquely human capacity to envision that which is not, but it's more than that. It's not just that. She goes on, in its arguably most transformative and revelatory capacity, get this, it is the power. Imagination is the power that enables us to empathize with humans whose experience we have never shared. She continues, unlike any other creature on the planet, humans can learn and understand without having experienced. They can think themselves into other people's places. And that's what the power of imagination, that's what the power of story does in the lives of the children and the teenagers in our lives, in our homes. It enables them to think themselves into other people's lives. It moves them to feel the sentiments of other people's emotion. It allows them to transport themselves into other people's reality, into other people's moments, into other people's situation. And the way when they do that, it shapes their very perspective on life. Stories, over time, shape someone's perspective. Stories give a kid the emotional, relational, moral, and spiritual perspective that they need. They see more, they feel more, they hope more. So the stories you and I tell to our kids, the stories that you and I tell to our students, our teenagers, matter. Because a teenager, a child, they have to imagine, get this, they have to imagine what their grandparents or what their parents thought and felt when times got tough. They have to imagine that, and they can. They can put themselves in your shoes based on the stories that you tell. Kids, teenagers, they need to imagine what went on in their parents' minds when they faced their biggest fears. Children need to imagine through the stories that we tell, they need to imagine what it takes for a hero to do the right thing without knowing if things are going to work out in the end. They have to imagine that, and they only can do that because of the stories that you and I choose to tell them. A child needs to imagine the voice of God talking to Moses through a burning bush. They have to imagine this miracle of a blind person seeing for the very first time, opening his eyes for the very first time after Jesus touched him. They have to imagine that. And they can put themselves in that person's sandals because of the stories you and I tell. And it develops, it changes, it shapes their perspective when we do that. A child, a teenager has to imagine the majesty of a heavenly dwelling place. Have you ever wondered what a child thinks heaven is like? The stories you tell them about heaven will shape their perspective. It's as if God gave us the gift of imagination so that we could imagine the unimaginable, right? God gave us the gift of imagination so that we could imagine the unimaginable. And as parents, we would be wise to do the same. As adults, we would be wise to do the same. And then get this, this is amazing. I just kind of blew my mind this week as I was preparing for today and thinking about this. Get this, the very God who fashioned your imagination to connect the stories, the God that did that, actually crafting stories to tell you about it. Because that's exactly what he did. Jesus showed up on the scene, and it's not like this way we portray it in movies, you know, where he was wearing a bathrobe and a blue Miss America sash, and he had rock-starred feather hair and kind of walked the beach, you know, hey, everybody. Like, it wasn't like, Jesus came onto the scene, and he said, hey, let me tell you a story to give you a glimpse into the nature, into the character of God. And he told stories to shape our perspective as to what God was really like. He said, God is like a father with a rebellious son. He said, God is like a rich person who goes off on a journey and leaves his estate into the hands of his servants. That's what God is like. God is like a bridegroom who throws this incredible wedding party. He tells these stories, and through his stories, he shapes our perspective as to what God is like. And then he took it a step further. Jesus being Jesus, this masterful storyteller, he not only gives us stories to understand what God is like, then he tells us stories to help us understand who we are and what we're like. And he invites us into the story. And Jesus says that we are like, that you and I are like a woman who pleads and begs an unjust judge to change his mind, and she pleads with him until he finally does. You and I are like that. You and I are like a builder who surveys two different types of land and scratches his head as he chooses between one that is rocky and one that is sandy. That's what we are like. We're like a traveler who shows up in the middle of this field and finds this incredible pearl just sitting there. You and I are like that. It's as if Jesus appealed to the imagination and then invited us into the action. And as parents, as adults present in the lives of the next generation, you and I would be wise to do the same, because the stories you tell, the stories I tell, they matter. They matter because we are inviting our children, we are inviting our teenagers to see the world, to shape their perspective, to see a bigger story. We're opening their eyes and opening up their imagination to realize they are a part of a bigger narrative, one where they were created and have the opportunity, they've been invited to play a significant role. That's what we can give our children. That's the perspective we can give our children with the stories we tell. I mean, why do you think Luke Skywalker from Star Wars and Frodo from Lord of the Rings and Aslan from the Chronicles of Narnia and a boy named Harry, why do you think these characters make such an impression on the hearts and the minds of kids? It's because it reminds them of the struggle between good and evil, right? It's evidence that there's this supernatural and miraculous power. And it allows them to see the potential for them to be restored and redeemed personally. And have you ever noticed that it seems like those themes are recycled over and over and over again? Have you ever noticed that? It's like the same story is just told with different characters and it's over and over and over again. Maybe it's because all of the stories in our culture echo the story, the greatest story of all time, the story of God. This ancient narrative where God is the main character and we have been invited into this much larger story, one that we can't possibly realize how big the scope of it is. That's what we can do in the lives of our kids. That's what the perspective that we can help them see. That all of these stories are so much bigger than they can possibly realize. They get invited into this bigger perspective. And we can do that with the stories we choose to tell them. We can expose them to the reality of a bigger narrative, one where God is the author. And with that bigger narrative, it allows them in the moment to face whatever comes next. It allows them to hope and continue to believe that good will eventually win out in the end. That's what our stories can do. And because of that, I believe that's why the psalmist wrote what I want to leave you with today. The psalmist in the Old Testament said, I will open my mouth with a parable. I will open my mouth with a parable, with a story. I will utter hidden things from of old, things that we have heard, things that we have known, things that our ancestors have told us. The psalmist said, look, I realize that stories are powerful. That stories shape and give perspective in the lives of children. And so I'm going to open my mouth and be quick to tell the story. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will get this, tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders that he has done. The psalmist could see, the psalmist realized the power of story. That children need to hear from people like you and I the stories that we have to tell, the things that we've experienced, the things that we've heard, the things that we've seen, because when we tell stories, we captivate imagination and they begin to see in a new way and it changes, it shapes their perspective. So, stories matter. Stories matter. This week, you have the opportunity to tell a story to the next generation in such a way that it will captivate their imagination. And it will move them to not only fall in love with the story itself, but to fall in love with the God who created the story and who invites them to play a significant role in a bigger story than they realize is taking place in their reality, in their moment. You can do that because stories over time shape someone's perspective. And again, not just anyone, not just someone, your child. The children under your roof, the children in your classrooms, the children on your sports teams, the children in your world. Stories, the stories you tell over time shape someone's perspective. So that means what you do this week matters. So tell them a story. Tell them a story. Get out the photo album and look back over your life and tell them your story. Grandparents, tell them stories. Tell them stories about your kids. Tell them about their parents when they were their age, and tell them about their lives. Tell them about the time they had their heart broken, the time that their dream crumbled, the time they fell in love, the time that they prayed, or the time that God showed himself to be real and present in their lives for the very first time. Tell them the story. Or maybe make up a story. Maybe you have a point that you're just desperately trying to instill, a value that you're trying to instill in your child or your teenager. Tell them a story to help them see the value that you're trying to impart into their lives, because you recognize how important it is for them to get it, that their future, their very future, depends on it. So tell them a story. Dust off the pages of Scripture. Dust it off. If you don't have a Bible, talk to me. I'll make sure you get one and open it up. And don't wait for our amazing team at Bridge Kids to tell your kids the stories found in the Scriptures. You tell them. Tell them the one again about how God created the heavens and the earth. Tell them about Moses and how tell them about the ark. Tell them about Jonah and the whale. Tell them about the lion's den. Tell them again about Jesus and what he did and how he walked on water and he healed the blind and how he rose from the dead. Tell them about the young boy who was on the battlefield and faced a giant, just like the giant they face on the playground every single day. Be careful with that one, or you'll get a call from the principal if you're not careful. But the point is, tell them a story. Tell them a story. Tell them your story. Make up a story. But the stories you tell matter, because the stories you tell shape their perspective. It shapes their perspective on God, on life, on morals, on values. It's so incredibly important. And the stories that you tell shape their perspective about who they are, where they came from, where they can go, and what they can do and what they can become. Stories over time shape someone's perspective. The stories you tell shape your child's perspective and shape my child's perspective. J.K. Rowling Rowling, however you choose to say her last name, again, is a famous author. And I don't know if you knew this, but the script for Harry Potter was written during her darkest hour in her life, her darkest season of her life. And in an interview that I watched with her about her, she talked about that period of her life. And here's what she said. An exceptionally short-lived marriage had imploded. I was jobless, I was a lone parent, and as poor as it's possible to be in modern Britain without being homeless. And then she says this about herself: I was the biggest failure that I knew. She went on, I was set free because my greatest fear had been realized and I was still alive. And I still had a daughter whom I adored, and I had an old typewriter and a big idea. And so rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. And so she typed, and she captured the imagination of a generation with a story about a boy named Harry, an unusual boy marked for a specific destiny from birth. And as he discovered his true identity and as he embraced his purpose, he grew in wisdom and in strength. And his closest friends followed him everywhere I went and oftentimes faced grave opposition. But they didn't always understand everything that he understood, and they couldn't follow him into his final battle against evil, where he went in and faced death itself and conquered it. Sound familiar? Does it sound familiar? See, regardless of what you think about Harry, the point is stories matter. And stories are powerful, especially when they echo the greatest story ever told. The greatest reality in history, that Jesus Christ came to this earth, that he walked among us and showed us what God looked like in flesh and blood. He faced death. He was crucified, but he was raised back to life, and he lives today. And because of what he has done and who he is and all that he is, our children, not just us, our children have significance and value and purpose. And that's the perspective that we can give them with the stories we tell them. So what you do this week matters. Stories over time shape someone's perspective, especially when they come from adults, from parents like you and I, who love them today and invest in them today so they are launched into their tomorrow with purpose and with perspective. So, this week, as we've been talking about, each week matters. This week, give them Give them the perspective they need by telling them a story. Because the bottom line is, every single one of us, we are losing our marbles, whether we like it or not. So, this week, let's make them count.